I keep falling through this hole in time, going back to 1917.
A film about a man in the 1980s becoming time besties with a World War I fighter ace, where one or the other or both flitter backwards and forward in time.
What the deuce are you doing in my plane?
I don't know.
It's either the second worst synopsis ever for terms of endearment, or we're looking at Biggles.
Let's take a look.
Biggles, or Biggles Adventures in Time, was a 1986 British-made adventure movie that took classic characters from British boys' own adventure stories and melded them with the story of somebody from the 1980s who finds himself dividing his time between the First World War and the 80s.
Choir practice is cancelled today.
It's not a combination that found much success when it was originally released, but has since found some fans and may have even turned a profit. It's not a terrible movie, nor a great one, but basically it's a fun 80s adventure movie, but a lousy Biggles movie, which is a shame because it's trying to be a Biggles movie that's a fun 80s adventure movie.
Yo, Biggles, hold on a second here.
That, of course, assumes that you have no pre-existing ties to the character of Biggles.
This is a photograph of him with his team. It's Algie, Bertie, and Ginger.
What are these guys, a vaudeville act?
In which case, the very thought of this movie is likely to cause a bit of a flap and make you do that valley weird, shaky, pointy thing.
Ought not to be allowed.
They'll start to whiz-bang us in a moment.
In reviewing anything called Biggles, you have to resist the temptation for the silly voices and RAF slang.
Top Hal! Bally Jerry, prang this kite right in the house your father.
But in that mode, this film had a bad prang and bought it after ending up in the drink.
What are you talking about?
Jim Ferguson lives in 1980s New York, where he's working on selling a range of TV dinners, where late at night he gets a knock on the door from a well-dressed older gentleman asking to be let in. Ignoring the interruption, Ferguson suddenly finds himself in a field just as a World War I plane crashes nearby. Jim helps the pilot out, who introduces himself.
I'm James Bigglesworth. My friends call me Biggles.
Jim zaps back to the present day, where he's more confused than a marmot tasting Marmite at Mardi Gras. At work, he's prepping for a presentation to clients with co-workers Chuck and Jim's girlfriend Debbie. The older gent, retired Air Commodore William Raymond, Biggles' former CEO, turns up at Jim's office, where Jim jumps at the chance of explaining what happened to him without being locked up. Raymond knows much of what's happened to Jim, leading Jim to start taking the idea of time travel slightly more seriously. Another time shift happens, sending Jim back. This time, he ends up in a plane with Biggles, where they're dogfighting against Biggles' rival, the German ace Erich von Stalheim. Biggles is trying to gather photographic evidence of a new German secret weapon. Zapping back to the 80s, Jim heads to London, where he meets up with Raymond at his office in the Tower Bridge. Jim happened to be holding Biggles' photographic plate when he zapped back to the present. Raymond's full title seems to be Air Commodore Exposition, where he casually talks about time travel.
Time travel is not unknown in history.
Now look, I casually talk about time travel all the time, where I plan on A, inventing time travel, B, build a working time machine, and C, travel back in time to give Sir Walter Raleigh an air fryer, a portable generator, a kitchen gadget that cuts fries, and a bottle of ketchup. It seems Jim and Biggles are time twins of a sort, where they can travel to each other's side in times of stress. I too have a time twin who lives as a cattle rustler in the Old West. I have to help him out every time he's about to be hung, and he pops up in my office whenever I have to use the printer.
Germany could well win the First World War. History would be altered, and you'll be stuck in 1917, a sort of time orphan, I suppose.
Raymond gives Jim gear so he's ready for his next bout of time travel. But of course, when he does next travel back, it's just at a time when he was shaving. Honestly, while so many of the time travel bouts lead Jim to embarrassing situations, there are obviously far worse times to suddenly find yourself time traveling.
You're Bertie, right? Algie? Ginger?
Jim meets up with Biggles' friends, and pretty soon the man himself. Biggles has his own problems. His girlfriend Marie is a spy wanted by both sides, and she's got information about the Germans' plans. The Germans close in on the convent, and again, Jim zaps back to London in the 1980s, just as Debbie and Chuck turn up.
What are you wearing that dress and hat for?
I told you it was personal.
Chuck already thinks Jim is nuts, and now he tries to have him committed, while Jim and Debbie end up zapping back to a First World War battlefield where it's Biggles and company. They'll discover a location where the Germans are testing their secret weapon. It turns out to be a sonic device that's devastatingly destructive. For fans of Biggles, all of this sonic weapon and time travel tomfoolery may seem far-fetched, like Vanilla Ice touring with Queen as a warm-up act.
Rather looks as though we're going to be the dummies.
But for 1980s moviegoers, it was half-price Tuesday. Jim and Debbie return to London, shoot at some armed cops for some reason before Biggles turns up in London. He meets with his now much older CEO, who's also apparently head of the Air Force's Context Squad, where he gives Biggles more context.
Computer enhancement?
Never mind, Fred. I've marked the position of the weapon for you.
Maybe they should go back in time and stop the secret weapon so it doesn't change history. Biggles and Jim steal a helicopter because Biggles is somehow able to pilot a vehicle that operates on a different principle to the one he'd flown, and he's also had no previous knowledge of the idea of helicopters. And anyway, they zap back in time with the chopper. Jim and Biggles destroy the secret weapon with the public address system. Marie is heavily wounded and Biggles faces off against his archenemy, where Biggles and von Stalhein try to kill each other with hand grenades. No, seriously, hand grenades.
Is he still alive?
Sadly, I don't know. Their last mission was to the high plateau of New Guinea.
It's Jim and Debbie's wedding, and then Jim zaps to Biggles' location for another adventure. The first of many adventures. This was it. One and done.
Biggles.
Lieutenant James Biggles of Bigglesworth was created by writer W.E. Johns and first appeared in magazines and books in 1932. Johns himself was in the Air Force during World War I and would end up writing about 100 books featuring the character and his chums set anywhere between World War I and the aftermath of World War II, with all of the boys' own style ripping yarns you could ask for without Michael Palin doing a parody of you.
Cheerio, Smudger.
Cheerio, Biffo.
Cheerio, Puppy.
Cheerio, Biffo.
Cheerio, Squidgy. Cheerio, Biffo. Cheerio, Biffo.
Cheerio, Biffo.
The boys' own genre was basically simplistic adventure stories set in various parts of the British Empire aimed at teenage boys, which were basically the early 20th century equivalent of action-adventure television series of the 80s.
Off we go.
Biggles was kind of a big deal back in the day in Britain, but well before my day, and in all likelihood before the time of many of the people who would see action-adventure movies in a cinema in the 80s. The character had already been on television, and attempts had been made from the late 60s to do something with Biggles as far as a big-screen film. It wasn't until the early 80s when things started to kick off with various people attached to the project, but getting a Biggles movie off the ground would need more than a sop with camel and favourable weather conditions.
What would Captain W.E. Johns have said? ?
By the time a film was ready to be made in the mid-80s, it now had a time travel aspect and American characters. Also, production had to be hurried in order to qualify for the Eady levy, which was being wound down. The Eady levy was a tax added to movie ticket sales in the UK that was used to fund productions made in Britain. It's a bit of a precursor to the sort of tax breaks you see around the world to encourage film production. In hindsight, would I have encouraged a film like this? I don't know. By the 80s, Biggles' cultural relevance to the sort of audience used to see movies in cinemas, mainly teenagers and kids, was probably limited. To Biggles fans, the notion of it being a science fiction movie was probably anathema.
Oh, not to be allowed.
So I'll just add it to the list of 4,000 other thin end of the wedges.
Scott, it's beyond comprehension.
But for everyone else who can, let go, how is this film? Biggles is alright. It's fun 1980s running around adventure. But it also probably would have done just as well or even better if it wasn't branded as a Biggles movie.
Oh, shit.
Because honestly, you could have substituted original characters and had pretty much the same effect.
The famous Biggles.
Biggles fans were probably not going to watch this because to them it wasn't Biggles. 80s movie fans were probably not going to watch this because what's a Biggles?
Biggles?
Biggles, that's right.
I'm also doing mental calculations over how many times I can get away with saying Biggles in a sentence before it seems overly gratuitous.
Biggles is your time twin.
Time twin?
This film is clearly not a movie with a big budget, but what budget it does have is used fairly wisely. We don't have massive aerial dogfights, but what we do have is a film where it's mostly captured in camera, putting the cast in aeroplanes. But at best, it's usually just 2 aeroplanes in the scene.
What are you gonna do?
The test grounds for the secret weapon looks amazing. The Beckton gasworks looks like it's been flattened by a bomb.
Looks like this town is nuked.
Nuked? What's that?
It's American slang word. It means to overreact.
So maybe the location's full name was, "Hey, gasworks, anyone got a match?" Shooting there does make the film look like it's had double the budget, and the same location would be seen in multiple films of the 80s. If it looks familiar, it's because Stanley Kubrick used it in Full Metal Jacket. Director John Huff had already directed several films and TV projects on both sides of the Atlantic, which is a plus because this is a film that can't decide if it's a film about an American time traveller or a legendary British character.
It could only be the great Biggles.
There are times when it's clearly influenced by music videos of the day, but thankfully most of the film is shot and edited like a movie and not a music video on MTV.
Keep it tight, asshole.
Peter Cushing aside, the Biggles cast is full of people who were better known in supporting roles elsewhere. Alex Hyde-White was in lots of little things, including the never-released Roger Corman Fantastic Four movie.
Let's kick some ass, old boy.
Neil Dickson was also in lots of little things here and there, and just picking three at random, Blake Seven, Sliders, and Mad Men.
I'm not going to put a bullet in your head, old boy. Because that's not the way we do business.
Fiona Hutchison would go on to star in daytime soap operas in the US.
Jim, this is all a big put on, isn't it? Like Fantasy Island, right?
Oh, come on, Debbie, it's not that bad. It's only World War I.
And William Hootkin was one of those American actors who lived in England and worked on lots of American films shot in the UK. Fans of British television of the 80s and 90s, and of course, yes, Doctor Who fans will spot people they recognise. But this Biggles was not the path to untold glory.
When are we going to dump that mountain of shit?
And for whatever reason, the acting in the World War I sequences seems a lot more believable and better than a lot of the 1980s set sequences, even if the actors appear in both time periods.
Listen, both of you, there's a very good explanation for all of this.
I sure hope so.
Biggles fans might think the whole movie stinks.
Oh, ought not to be allowed.
To me, though, the movie starts quite poorly for the first 15 or so minutes where it's set in fake New York, where it's just tentative and a little forced. And then the film loosens up and finds its feet once Jim gets to London, at which point it becomes a fun time travel romp, leading to a setup for future adventures, which of course did not eventuate. It has the look and feel of a British television show made in the 90s, just a little bit earlier. Though in general, it's usually not the cast or the visuals that drag this down, it's the music. By far the single least effective aspect of the movie, the electronic score does not work well at all in this movie, ruining a lot of the atmosphere. It's not that the score uses synthesizers and samplers in a pop song, it's that it doesn't work in this movie, particularly when much of it is set during World War I.
I'm sure all of this is very real to you.
I rented Biggles sometime in the 80s and didn't think much of it at the time. It was kind of lightweight and disposable, even more so than much of the lightweight and disposable dreck I actually liked at the time. Watching it now, I like it well enough. After the rocky start, it starts to coalesce. It's solid entertainment for an afternoon passed out on the couch from eating too many hot dogs, rather than an outstanding cinema experience. If I had seen this in the cinema, I may have drained the battery on my digital watch to use the light to read the text on the bottom of the empty popcorn bucket, because suddenly I would have had an urge to know what company made the bucket.
I'm helping this guy named Biggles find and destroy a German secret weapon.
It's not a British Back to the Future. I mean, this film had finished filming long before Back to the Future was released in 1985.
I don't know the why of it, only that it happened.
A £7 million budget went a long way, but its 1986 release in the UK didn't do much to make back its budget. The film would eventually be released in the US in 1988, where it gained a slightly different name, Biggles Adventures in Time. To say the film struggled at the US box office is an understatement, on the level of suggesting the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 was a hiccup.
Hey, this is the finest dog puke they've ever tasted.
The movie may have ticked over into a small profit with smaller markets and eventual TV sales and video rental income, but there wasn't much movement on making sequels like, Biggles vs. Bigfoot, Biggles Goes to Mars, and finally Biggles and the Eurovision Song Contest, where Biggles performs his biggest hit, Video Killed the Radio Star.
I would never have believed it if I hadn't experienced it.
If I was to take three mid-80s, modestly budgeted British-made genre flicks made for an international audience and compare them to each other, Superman 4 would be our baseline for an absolute rubbish film made in Britain, and Highlander would be the top. Biggles being in between the two extremes would be much closer to Highlander than Superman 4. The Biggles movie is probably at least 20 years too late to the Biggles party, which quite honestly sounds like it would have been a bit of a sausage fest. As a slice of mid-80s tomfoolery, it's fun enough if you have no ties to the world of Biggles. But at the same time, what was the point of it all? If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
must call me Mr. Biggles, or Group Captain Biggles, or Mary Biggles if I'm dressed as my wife.